Daniel, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you. Really, really grateful for the opportunity.
Why don't we start off with your background? Where'd you start off? Where have you been in your career, and where are you now?
Sure. So I'm a lapsed political scientist. I started off my career, did a PhD in government. I taught political science at Wabash College. I did a congressional fellowship in the 104th Congress in Majority Leader Dick Armey's office. And then shortly thereafter, I left the academy, and we'll come full circle back to Congress, but I spent 7 years with the Boston Consulting Group doing management consulting in the U.S. and Southeast Asia. Then I joined the Bridgespan Group, which is a nonprofit consultancy. And in the course of my work at Bridgespan, I came to focus more and more on organizations that were funded by government, nonprofits that were funded by government. And this was in the early 2010s, 2011, 12, when government, I think, was really starting to falter under the current, kind of the polarization that's obviously been exacerbated since then. And I got to thinking, maybe we need to think just more about how our democracy is working or not working. At that time, I had an offer to join the Hewlett Foundation, which is a philanthropy based in Menlo Park, California, to start up a new grant-making program focusing on strengthening U.S. democracy, which I joined Hewlett in 2013. And then over the next 9 years, really through March of a year ago, I developed a strategy for and then directed what amounted to nearly about $180 million in grant-making over that period, probably at least half of which was focusing in some way or another on strengthening Congress as an institution. Hewlett has term limits for grant makers. My joke is that they're a bad idea for lawmakers, but a good idea for philanthropic funders. So I came to the end of my term in March of 2022. And since then, I've started up a new venture, which we could maybe talk about later, called Lyceum Labs, which is focusing on trying to reimagine what political leadership and political parties would look like that would serve our kind of pluralistic and disputatious democracy. So that's the new work I've started since leaving Hewlett.
Great. Can you talk about what brought you into this area to begin with? What was it that took you to Congress in the first place, and that political science degree? And your work in the academy, and then why did you wind up leaving it and go to consulting? And did the consulting bring you any unique perspectives back on the government or on the systems of democracy?
Sure. So I have always been drawn to politics and leadership and American history. And the dissertation, which eventually became my book, not to plug it, but you can still find it on Amazon, on Woodrow Wilson, was focused on, how to assemble kind of catalytic leadership in our system of separated powers. But I was really coming at that from the angle of presidential leadership and party government, not so much Congress. Although in the course of my grad school, I had obviously gone deep on different aspects of the legislative process in Congress. And in my historical research, it really focused on the work of Congress in the progressive era. But it wasn't until I started the Congressional Fellowship. This was a really heady time to be working in Congress. It was the first time that the Republicans had held the majority in the House for 40 years. They were halfway through advancing the agenda that came out of the Contract with America. And I just had an incredible vantage point on this in the House Majority Leader's office. And I was doing a lot of projects with people from the Speaker's office. And, it just gave me an incredible appreciation for the role that Congress plays in representing this really incredibly diverse country with all the different values and interests and convictions and agendas that people have, and how the institution serves as a place where those different and often conflicting, in some cases just purely incommensurate goals are hashed out. And I left that fellowship year with just a profound appreciation for the institution. There was a number of personal family factors that led me to leave the academy and go into management consulting. One of them was, I'm really proud of my book and my work, but it took me 7 or 8 years to write a good book when I had colleagues who were doing 2 or 3 in that same period. So I realized that maybe being an academic was not necessarily my forte. And I will say the time in consulting, management consulting, especially with the Boston Consulting Group, where I was basically advising Fortune 500 companies on strategy and operations. I did a lot of work in industrial goods. There were a couple of connections with the prior experience as an academic and then as a fellow working in government. One was, I just had a profound appreciation, or I had a knowledge for how the government works and the budget and the process, and so much of the kind of the parameters of business strategy for these companies was set by government policy and government funding. So for example, one of my early clients was a company that made medical devices that were reimbursed under Medicare. And, I was the only one in the team who had a feel for what is Medicare as a policy, how is it set, how does it change, how does it evolve? So I could bring some of that knowledge to bear in policy debates. But the other intersection between the political world was and government world in my time at BCG is towards the end of my term, we started to serve, and I ended up helping BCG start a federal practice. So BCG had traditionally only worked with private sector companies. Paul O'Neill, who had been, before he joined the Bush administration as Secretary of the Treasury, had been a senior executive at an international paper and then CEO of Alcoa, where BCG had worked closely with him. He had a number of changes he was trying to bring about at the Department of Treasury and turned to BCG for help. And most of my colleagues who are really focused on kind of getting ahead and working with clients of business that wanted no part of working with a cabinet secretary. And I thought that sounded really interesting. So I signed up for that, and that led me to work with a number of kind of cabinet and sub-cabinet clients over my last 2 or 3 years at BCG. And I think having the congressional experience and then ironically, with helping executive branch clients, most of whom had come in from the private sector without really having much of a feel for Congress and how it works, the fact that I had that experience enabled me, I think, to provide better advisory services to those executive branch clients, all of whom were political appointees. So anyway, that's a quick Cook's tour of the first part of my career. Yep.
And so you wound up writing something called, the 2 pathways to reform. Can you talk about that? What inspired that document, and can you outline the questions you had there and what you answered with the article?
Sure. So this was a piece that I wrote. So after in the late aughts, I joined the Bridgespan Group, which was a nonprofit consultancy and worked primarily with nonprofit clients. And then I accepted an offer from the Hewlett Foundation to really start a new program focused on strengthening democracy. And Hewlett is a grant-making entity, so we were making grants to nonprofit organizations. And both me and my boss and mentor, Larry Kramer, who's the president of the foundation, shared this hypothesis that at the time, this was in 2013, we got started, Congress was really faltering. And as the first branch of government, if Congress isn't working, then the rest of the government is just by definition going to struggle. So we early on, were exploring what could a philanthropy that can't support or oppose any candidate or party by law, and can only kind of underwrite nonprofit entities and cannot earmark funds directly for lobbying, what, if anything, could a philanthropic entity do to support strengthening our governing institutions? And so that was a question we were grappling with. At the same time, I was struck by how there was really a dearth of conservative and right of center at the time thinking about Congress and how it was functioning in civil society. There were Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann had just written their book on It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and there was a lot of what I would call more conventionally liberal or moderate or progressive critiques of Congress, but there weren't people on the center right who were digging into that. Now, and so one of the first things we did was to try and identify bona fide conservatives and libertarians who were thinking institutionally and who had a an interest in trying to think about ways of strengthening Congress. And a team came together at the R Street Institute. A team came together initially with Yuval Levin at National Affairs. He then moved over to AEI. The Federalist Society developed an Article 1 initiative. So there was a group of people starting to emerge, and we were supporting them at Hewlett. We had also reached out to the American Enterprise Institute. This was before Yuval and his team arrived, and a couple of right of center scholars in the academy, Jack Pitney at Claremont McKenna College, and Bill Connolly at Washington and Lee, and Gary Schmidt, who was at AEI. And so the three of them, we underwrote the three of them to host a conference on congressional reform, and to what extent is Congress broken, or was the polarization and partisanship and gridlock was in some ways that functional, and if it wasn't functional, where and how could that be improved? So the original work I did on the two pathways for congressional reform really was writing a paper for that conference, and I was interested in exploring in prior instances where Congress took steps to reform itself in ways that really left the institution in a stronger place. How did that occur? What were the processes through which that occurred? And I wanted to look just historically, just say, here's a couple of examples to kind of take it out of the current context, which was politically charged and contentious. And so that took me back to the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946, which was occurred right after Congress, right after World War II. Congress was endeavoring to kind of recover some of its strength vis-a-vis the executive branch, which had really come to the fore in the Great Depression and the war. And it led to the establishment of the initial kind of staff in Congress, and the idea of oversight and oversight of the executive is a key thrust of Congress's work, and kind of codified that in conjunction with a number of other major changes. Well, anyway, so a couple of things occurred. One is, as I was looking into that, it really seemed to me that that was an attempt for Congress to kind of recapture some of its initiative and role in the context of the separation of powers, which I think has been the need recently. So that was interesting. And then I also came across an obscure reference to an American Political Science Association Committee on Congress. And when I first read this, I thought it was a mistake, because for the political scientist listening will know that there was a very famous American Political Science Association Committee on Political Parties that wrote a report called Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System in 1950 that really, I think, set the agenda for the emergence of modern polarized parties in this country, which I think are part of the problem. But I completed a PhD, did all my requirements in American politics for that PhD. I'd never come across this idea that there was a committee on Congress. Sure enough, there was. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. But it was such an obscure report that I couldn't find a copy of it. And so finally, my friend Don Wolfensberger at the Wilson Center, I was mentioning this to him and asking him if he had come across this. So yeah, I've got a paper copy. So literally, he mimeographed or copied a paper copy of this report and sent it to me. And I just became fascinated by the content in this report. And this report was produced, I think, in 1945, was when it was kind of released. But it was the product of about 5 or 6 years of intensive interaction between a few people on this committee, kind of in civil society, affiliated with the APSA, local professors at other institutions, and advocates for strengthening Congress, and reform-minded institutionalists inside Congress who wanted to strengthen the institution and help it recapture its initiative vis-a-vis the executive branch. So the story of this, the APSA report, as I dug into it, became a story of how Congress was working with partners outside of the institution to test out, develop, and write up ideas for how reformers inside the institution could do so. And once this report was delivered with a set of recommendations. The Congress set up a joint select committee on reorganization, and a gentleman named George Galloway, who was the kind of chair of this APSA committee, was brought in-house to serve as the staff director for this joint select committee, which issued a report which basically was the blueprint that became the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946. So, right then, so I was writing this paper in 2014, 2015, just as we were trying to think, how does Congress as an institution change, and what are the role of civil society organizations and funders like the one I was working at, and potentially fostering and supporting that impulse within the institution, recognizing that there always would have to be an arm's length relationship. So the 1946, the work in the 40s that led to the Legislative Reorganization Act really became a template for me. And I went on in the paper to contrast the recommendations of that initial APSA committee, which was really working what I described as working with the grain of the separation of powers and the checks and balances, and trying to strengthen Congress as the first branch of government. And I contrasted that with the much more non-obscure, highly prominent report of the APSA Committee on Parties, which basically was trying to push aside the separation of powers and the checks and balances and almost establish parliamentary style responsible party government in the United States, and having ideologically distinct parties that were carrying those agendas forward. And that report, and a good chunk of my analysis in the paper was really looking at, we talk about that as being towards a more responsible two-party system. But if you read the report, it's actually a sustained critique of Congress. It's a sustained critique of the modes of representation, of the attentiveness to local circumstances, of the checks and balances that were woven into Congress. Now, a lot of those were problematic at that juncture, because this was the heyday of the seniority system, and most of the key chairmanships, by dint of the way our politics had evolved, were held by Southerners. So you had a kind of a conservative bent to Congress, which is why the more liberal or progressive reformers had seized on this idea of responsible party government to really subordinate the role of the seniority system in the chairs and make the parties much more coherent. But what I was suggesting is that the APSA Committee on Congress really had the right idea, and they were trying to say, within the American system, with our constitutional arrangements, what's the best way to strengthen the legislature? I think their solution, even though it's much less well known in the field, was really the right approach. So anyway, that's a quick story on that chapter. Happy to field any questions you have about it.
So I'm curious about, this draw of the parliamentary style, right? And I've noticed that in my discussion with a lot of academics, that a fair number of academics are very much attracted by this parliamentary mode. And even Wilson, right? If we go back to your man Wilson, and your work on Wilson, I mean, he was also of that. I think, if I recall, he was an advocate for a parliamentary system, as opposed to what we have. So why is this parliamentary model so attractive to so many academic people?
Yes, it's a good question, and in fact, my book on Wilson was basically an intellectual history of his critique of the separation of powers, which, like the APSA Committee on Parties, was also a critique of Congress. Wilson worked through all of his adult life, initially as an academic, and then as a governor of New Jersey and as president, to try and replicate, insofar as he could, the parliamentary logic in the American system. And I think there's a few different factors. One is, the parliamentary model, sweeps aside a lot of the things that Americans and some academics don't like about Congress and politics: the horse trading, the log rolling, the compromising, the politicking, the arcane rules, the formal processes, and the extent to which it's not always clear who's in the right and who's in the wrong. And Wilson and a number of reformers since then, what they've appreciated about their idealized conception of parliament, and I say idealized because, quite frankly, their parliamentary ideal is not one that's has, with a few exceptions, been observed in the wild, maybe in New Zealand recently. They like this grand clash of parties where you have a principled discussion between the government and the opposition, and one party that is responsible for what the government does. And effectively, what the parliamentary system does is pull politics out of the legislature and settle things at elections, right? You have an election, one side wins, and each party's put forward their mandate. The voters decide party A or party B. Party A, then, if they win, they get to go ahead and implement their mandate, and then the voters can hold them accountable again at the next election. What that sweeps aside is all the representation and negotiation and compromise that typically occurs in the legislature and in Congress between elections. That's, I think, the primary thing they don't like. So, and Wilson, described the separation of powers as a radical defect of our Constitution. And what he talked about instead is power and strict accountability for its use. That's what leads to good government. And what I do in my book, and generally what I've appreciated, is pulled that thread through. And if you look at E. Schatzsnyder, who was the great mid-century advocate of party government, the APSA Committee on Parties, and more recently, reformers like James McGregor Burns and James Sundquist, they have all advocated Lloyd Cutler for some type of parliamentary system. And again, I think you're seeing a resurgence of that among some academics and think tankers today.
But doesn't a lot of this parliamentary mode of thinking just internalize a lot of those problems in the parties themselves, right? And makes them then not transparent to the public, right? So if you're battling out for local issues inside the Congress, it's transparent, it's open. Whereas if you put them in if you move that conflict into the parties themselves, and because there has to be some mechanism for the party to act unilaterally one way or the other, right? And but in effect, they have to do that process then inside the parties. Isn't it just moving the problem into an opaque organization?
Yes. No, you're exactly right. And I think, and what you also see, the presumption, and again, the title of the 1950 essay report was toward a more responsible two-party system. But at the time, there were likely 3 or 4 effective parties in the country. You had the conservative Southern Democrats, the segregationists, you had the Northern Liberal Democrats, and then you had kind of more liberal and conservative Republicans. So, if you were to translate that, and they presume that, these differences within the parties can be ironed out so that we can have 2 competing parties, a more likely outcome, given that our republic is set up on a continental scale and intentionally embodies all these diverse and competing values and agendas, is a multi-party system. And anyone who's a fan of Borgen, it's one of my favorite shows, which is this. I'm nerding out here, but it's this story of parliamentary politics in Denmark. And you're exactly right that it's really the coalition assembly and disassembly and repackaging all occurs among political elites outside of parliament, and it takes conflict of, rather than hashing it out between elected representatives who are accountable for what they do, it leads it to be hashed out by party elites. And so, I think to me, the die has been cast in the American system for a separation of powers with an independent legislature. And, we can kick against the goads of that, or we can ask ourselves, which I've been trying to do, okay, if this is our basic institutional framework, what can we do to work within the grain of this framework to improve how our legislative branch works? And that's where I've been focused in my work.
So then let's move on to the Hewlett work that you did. Obviously, you were supporting a lot of organizations trying to improve Congress. Can you talk through what you did at Hewlett, how it evolved over time, and what did you fund, and what did you think worked, and what do you think didn't?
Yeah, so we started off and calling our work the Madison Initiative for a couple of reasons. One is we saw Madison as someone at the time, this may no longer be the case, someone that liberals and progressives could like because he was effectively the author of the Bill of Rights. Conservatives liked him. In fact, the Federalist Society uses his silhouette as their logo. And it was really the kind of the theorist of the Constitution, and then the practical initial implementer of Congress, right? Is effectively the leader in the early Congress. And but the other thing that appealed to us about Madison was that at multiple junctures, even though he had ideas about how things should work, right? He came into the Constitutional Convention with the Virginia Plan, which provided an outline, but quickly was adulterated beyond his own recognition, if you will. But then he became the staunchest advocate for the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. And then subsequently, he had said during the ratifying convention initially, we don't need a Bill of Rights. We've enumerated the powers of Congress. And then he realized if he wanted to get the Constitution ratified in Virginia, he had to commit to saying, we'll work on a Bill of Rights. And so that idea of you think through problems, you come up with your proposals, you submit them, and if you have the votes, you carry the day. If you don't, you, in a republic, you figure out how to go along with your plan B. That spirit of working as a statesman was something that really appealed to me, to my boss, Larry Kramer, and to our team. So that the Madison Initiative was really initially focused on trying to think where and how could we make a difference in helping Congress work better. And there were a number of initial thrusts to that work. We provided seed funding, as I mentioned, for a number of right-of-center people in the think tank world working on supporting Congress. People, institutions like at the Congressional Management Foundation and other institutions that were working to strengthen Congress as an institution. And I think those groups were, and people like Marcy Harris and Dan Schuman, and with their respective organizations, and Molly Reynolds at the Brookings Institution was another one. And, these were people and institutions and programs that were trying to work on Congress a little bit off the side of their desk, right? So they didn't necessarily have funding to do this. And I think the biggest contribution we made as a funder coming along is we're going to underwrite the work you're doing towards this end. What that work should be, we'll leave it up to you, so long as we share this value that Congress, as our first branch of government, is really important to function well, and we share a view of a republic in which it's functioning well. The contributions you want to make towards that end, we'll leave that up to you. So another thing we did, so focusing on Congress, working with people across the political spectrum that shared our goals. And then I think the third thing was, generally providing what we called longer-term general operating support. So rather than specify, we want you to do project A in B timeframe with C deliverables, we would underwrite people. And most of our funding went out in the form of these general support grants we'd fund someone over a 3 or 4 year period and leave them free with the initiative to react and respond to how things are working. So a really good example of this strategy of not overly specifying what grantees, how grantees operate, came to the fore during the pandemic, right? So suddenly Congress is, at risk of just being paralyzed because it can't meet in person. And, I still remember Brad Fitch kind of leaped into the fold, and he and his team and a few others figured out how Congress could hold remote town halls in ways that were fruitful. Marcy Harris jumped in and, basically did a prototype of a remote committee hearing and demonstrated how that could work. There was a lot of effort being put into supporting staff. And I should mention here that my colleague, Jean Bordewick, who had been staff director of the Senate Rules Committee, and I hired Jean because she had this in-depth expertise and knew the institution backwards and forwards. One of Jean's ongoing emphases was to strengthen the quality and quantity and diversity of congressional staff so that Congress could equip itself to do its mission. And of course, in the pandemic, and then certainly after January 6th, it was really hard to be a congressional staffer. And so the range of grantees figuring out ways how to be supportive of staff, how to affirm the essential work that they're doing, I think that was another element of what we did that in retrospect turned out to be helpful.
And what about things that didn't go as well, that you invested in and you realized that approach didn't yield the results that you wanted, or took on challenges that were too difficult to move the needle anywhere?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a number, like all things, there's a distribution. There was a number of things that we did, not so much in the congressional domain, but I'll just give you an example. We spent a lot of money over time trying to help our institutions cope better with the problem of big money in politics and fundraising, and really didn't make much headway in that space over this period of time. And frankly, came also to appreciate that, while not ideal, that problem may have been something that advocates in the space were more apt to flag as a massive problem than some of the practitioners in the space. And so, that's a place where we in retrospect may have misallocated some resources. We all believe and continue to believe that disclosure of funding is a really important thing. So we have heavily backstopped, and I should say we, the Hewlett Foundation. I'm no longer employed there. I still use the royal we as a label. Underwrote the National Institute for Money and Politics and the Center for Responsive Politics to focus on the disclosure and transparency related issues, and they're still going strong. So, but there wasn't the shift in policy that I think we thought may have been possible in the 2013, 2014 era. So that would be an example of some reforms that didn't in the end pan out. I think we also, frankly, luck and fortune and contingency play a role in all this. So, I think the grantees we have been working with, and I'm talking about, probably upwards in the end of 20 organizations, most of whom were involved in the congressional reform cohort. I know you and your colleagues have, as you got started, joined that, and JD was obviously working on the committee itself. I know they had been working behind the scenes to try and help Congress become more attentive to the need to think through what a reform agenda looks like. But certainly the formation of the Select Committee on Modernization in the House, occurring when it did in 2018, or after the 2018 election, was a huge breakthrough. That was a lucky break because it then gave a vehicle for a lot of these efforts to come together, at least as it pertains to the House. That was a lucky breakthrough. I think a second lucky breakthrough were having the initial leaders of that, Derek Kilmer and Tom Price, as I recall, from Georgia, but certainly Derek Kilmer, who kind of was the chair throughout the 4 years of that committee, leading in a very inspired and productive and results-oriented, and I think critically bipartisan way, made a huge difference. So it was good fortune to have the committee formed. It was good fortune to have someone of Derek Kilmer's capacity leading it, and that then provided over a 4-year period the NGOs that we had been supporting a lot of opportunities to both bring their good ideas to bear with members of Congress who were really receptive to them, but also to be responsive to those members. So those members had questions, agendas, and like I think Molly Reynolds testified upwards of 8 times before that committee over the 4 years. And so that was really a validation of the theory of change, and skill and luck and money all came together, I think, in constructive ways.
Looking back on the committee, now that it's moved in some form to a subcommittee on the House administration, thinking about what it achieved versus, where you think there's still a lot of work to be done. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think um, it's a really good question. I think and we can put in the show notes. I recently, as it was winding down its work earlier this year, I just wrote a blog post kind of reflecting on. I think I referred to it as the best kept secret in the secret Congress, which is, I think it was a incredibly fruitful exercise. Um, and I think there were some really big things around, in particular, finding ways to build a consensus around the reestablishment of earmarks, or I think now it goes by a new name, but that was something that I think had really severed the representational tie and awareness. And I think over time, as more members get in the business of thinking about, okay, how do we fund key projects in our districts, I think that is a really lasting legacy. And I think just a legacy around the attentiveness to staffing and the institutional capacity to support, recruit, retain, develop high quality staff. And I think that committee became a little bit a repository for the aspirations and ideas for the House as a whole, around how do we make this institution work better. And I would say I'm realistic but not cynical when it comes to Congress. So I do think the 435 members, there are some people who are maybe not public spirited and who are kind of intentionally running against and running down the institution. But I think certainly a majority of members care about the place, see themselves as stewards in some way. It's just that their day-to-day jobs and political positions don't really give them much opportunity to reflect on and operationalize that institutional concern. And I think the select committee became a little bit of a repository. If you look at the inbound testimony and I thought, wise and adept solicitation of member input, broader member input outside of the committee that people undertook. And I think it's also fair to say that, it wasn't obvious, in January of 2021, after the storming of the Capitol, that committee could reconvene with anything approaching the goodwill and forward momentum that it had enjoyed in the previous Congress. And I think, again, I point to Chair Kilmer as someone who, found a way to work with his Republican colleagues and in ways that maybe not all of his colleagues in the Democratic Party writ large would have been prepared to do. And I think that in some ways kind of contributed. I think the functioning of that committee and in the Congress that followed was also an important part of the return to normalcy.
And what about looking back at your original project when you viewed that was it the 1946 report and then the subsequent committee and what they achieved? Do you think that we can get to that level of scale of institutional change? Because obviously the select committee is great, but it's on the House side. They passed a lot of things, big and small, but fundamental change might require that kind of joint approach between the House and the Senate, that was looked at back then. What are your thoughts on the prospects for that kind of that scale change?
100% agree. And I think it was both the big difference between that episode in the mid 40s and the most recent episode, as you point out. One is the earlier one was truly bicameral. It was a joint select committee. And there was, foundational legislation that emerged from it that also recast and reset the relationship. And, as we're already seeing, with the new Congress, some of the achievements, and I'm not necessarily up to date on all the latest details, some of the achievements of the select committee in recent years are at risk because they aren't really embodied in legislative statutes. So I think it needs to be bicameral. There ultimately will need to be some legislation. The thing that gives me hope, and I know Molly Reynolds and a few others are leading, James Wallner are leading an effort to kind of bring some of the same thinking to the Senate. I think there are real institutionalists in the Senate that care about it, especially staff and members. When and how that can occur, and it's not only having it occur in the Senate, but have it be synced up with what's been happening and continues to happen in the House. I think that's really the work for this reform cohort in civil society in the years ahead. But I'm cautiously optimistic.
And so what do you think will happen to the community of, that civil society you mentioned earlier that you help spawn, right, or help support through your funding? As you said, the term limits, maybe they're good for Hewlett. I'm not sure they're great for Congress in terms of, in terms of making sure all these good-hearted people in the civics area are continuing to work on Congress and can support themselves. So I'm curious what you think about, where it's going to go from here. Who will fund them? How will that move forward?
Yeah, no, and I should also mention that over that period that Hewlett was investing deeply in the congressional reform space, largely under the leadership of my colleague Jean Bordewick, who was the program officer overseeing all that work. She teamed closely with people at the Democracy Fund, Betsy Hawkins initially, and then Laura Flint and other colleagues there. And I'm not privy to what the Democracy Fund and the Hewlett Foundation now have planned vis-a-vis Congress. I think there are really smart and experienced people at both institutions that recognize the need for a functioning Congress. In all honesty, I think it's really important for foundations and philanthropy and individual donors, family office donors, to get more people in the mix. And I wrote a piece, another one we can put in the show notes, about a year ago, explicitly to funders thinking about how to strengthen democracy, and just made the point that the vast majority of philanthropic funding vis-a-vis democracy is going to what I would call the input side of the equation, which is election administration, election reform, community mobilization, voter information. And there's nothing wrong with that work, but just a few low single digits percentage of funding of what is a quite substantial amount of funding. So for example, in 2020, we know that there's probably a conservative estimate, 2.5 billion with a B funding going from philanthropy to strengthen some aspect of U.S. democracy. And just, again, I think it was 3 or 4% of that was going to strengthen governing institutions like Congress, I think there's argument to be made for strengthening executive branch institutions. So I think the flywheel is starting to turn with institutional funders being aware of, it won't do us any good to get the inputs sorted out if the throughputs or the institutions through which those inputs ultimately need to be processed are faltering. And so I think there is potentially some headway there, but it'll be really important. And these groups in civil society need some winds in their sails to continue to carry out their work. So I've tried to now be advocating for that approach from my perch outside of the foundation world.
So let's move on to Lyceum Labs. Can you talk to us about what is it? Why are you doing it? What is it looking to achieve?
Yeah, so Lyceum Labs, it's a new nonprofit venture, and it really focused on a couple of basic questions. One is, what would it take to have political leadership and political parties that would strengthen and reinforce the values and norms and aspirations of our democracy, instead of as in too many instances they do today, undermining them. And there's a couple of premises behind this broad question. One premise is you can't have a democracy without leadership. You need leaders, and leaders shape what happens in the democracy much more than we like to admit. Likewise with political parties, democracy is about majority rule, and political parties in a nation of free and equal citizens are how you build up to a majority and then hold that majority accountable. So if you want to have a representative democracy, you need leaders and parties. And so rather than trying to rein them in or marginalize them or to denigrate them, the premise behind Lyceum Labs is we need to think about what good looks like with respect to these two essential components, and how do we get more of that? And that's where I'm focused. And I'm emphasizing this. It was an opportunity I saw at Hewlett. It was a little bit woven into our theory of change, and part around strengthening Congress, is that we recognize that people take cues about what to believe and how to think about their fellow citizens from leaders who are giving them messages about that. And those messages can either be reinforcing social cohesion and patriotism and a sense of pluralism. They need to make trade-offs, or they can be undermining them. And I think we've seen examples of both in recent years. And so I think at Hewlett, we had the premise that the leader's role in democracy is really important. But likewise with political parties is the way in which people organize themselves to do things in a democracy. There's a couple of barriers, though, that have, I think, led these to be somewhat blind spots in civil society. One is that foundations and the grantees that they support in the kind of what in the tax code is the 501c3 world are prescribed by law from supporting or opposing any candidate or party. And so it's natural then for foundations and their grantees to presume, okay, we can't really talk about leadership or the nature of parties because that seems a lot like we're supporting or opposing candidates or parties. But I'm just talking about these qualities in general, not endorsing or opposing parties or candidates in particular. But I think there also is, I would say, a bottom-up bias in thinking about democracy and civil society. Democracy is about empowering voters to select their representatives and then hold them accountable. And at one level, yes, it is that. There is a discomfort with the idea that we are electing representatives who then work on our behalf and will do that work better or worse depending on the qualities and the motives and the purposes that they bring with them to their office. That seems to give them a lot more agency than we might be comfortable with if truly the people are the boss. And ultimately and formally, yes, the people are the boss, but in the meantime, the people we elect to work in the federal government and represent us there have a lot of autonomy. And so we're never going to control that or completely rule it out. So how do we think about the kind of people that can take that autonomy and put it to great use on our behalf? Those are the kind of key things we're trying to get at with Lyceum Labs.
And so on the one side, it sounds like it's this leadership, generally speaking, and then it's also, you mentioned the parties themselves. What is it that you're thinking about when it comes to parties?
Yeah, with parties, going back to the APSA Committee on Parties in the 1950s, a couple of things have happened. One is our parties have become much more polarized, so that rather than having overlapping and pragmatic and heterogeneous parties of the kind we always have traditionally had, we now have two clearly distinguished and much more internally coherent parties, which, in my view, is really a bad fit for our diverse and pluralistic republic. Thing one. The other thing that's happened coincident with that polarization has been the nationalization of our politics. And so the political fights we're having all are taking place in what I have taken to be calling the Thunderdome of American politics. And what we've really lost sight of is what's happening in particular communities and states and localities, which are really different and have different needs and circumstances. And I think it's worth noting where the vast majority of governing occurs in the United States. So if you look at all the things that really matter for people's lives, schools, roads, transit, housing, public health, those are all local and state matters, not so much federal matters. And so I think what we need to do with our parties is to decentralize them. And I think that we've often looked at parties and how do we depolarize them? I've become increasingly convinced as the way to depolarize our parties is to denationalize them, to decentralize them, to try and breathe life back into the local and state party organizations that to flourish really do need to be attentive to what the unique circumstances of their particular geographies have. And so part of what we're trying to do under parties is to kind of support scholars and others who are thinking about that revitalization of party organizations. I think another thing we're trying to do to bring more pluralism to the party system is to notice, observe, reflect on, and lift up people who are really creatively building factions within the party to kind of break out of the coherent lockstep that partisans have fallen in both the Republican and Democratic side of things. So, you know, some of our partners here are really interesting and robust people in the Democratic Party that are trying to make it a big tent Democratic Party and appeal to centrists and moderates and independents and even disaffected Republican voters that the most prominent ideological part of the Democratic Party is no longer really in a position to speak to. I think a big tent Democratic Party would be a really good thing for our democracy. Likewise, I'm working with and supporting people in the Republican Party that are trying, in effect, to do the same thing within the Republican Party. So the decentralization and the support for kind of factional elbow room within the parties, I think those are a couple of promising developments.
Do you think that, you know, there are proposals out there to increase the size of the House, right? Does your thinking go along with those that, you know,
No.
if you increase the number of House districts, then you get more of that localization of politics, or do you think it doesn't matter given the current state of the?
Yeah, I'm broadly sympathetic to having increasing the size of the House. I'm laughing a bit because, of course, you know, in the founding period, the anti-federalists were, you know, Madison was seen as someone who had a massively small, you know, massively large districts, and the idea of larger districts, which I think were in the mid five figures in terms of populations, plus the 2-year Congress were both seen as way too empowering of the House. So now, putting that background aside, I know we need to retain that for the final cut here. I think that could be helpful. Here's my basic point, and another reason I started Lyceum Labs is the democracy reform field, to my mind, has tended to focus too much on what I would call structural reform of the rules of the game, whether it's nonpartisan redistricting or, you know, different flavors of primary reform or ranked choice voting, or, you know, the size of the House. And, you know, in certain places, in certain instances, those changes can be fruitful, but they almost always have muted effects. They almost always have some unanticipated effects. And the premise behind Lyceum Labs is, rather than, you know, reversing the logic, rather than saying, well, we need to change the rules of the game, in this case, the size of members in the House, to get to the politics we want, our view is we need to reform politics to get to you know, we need to, what I could say, party better and lead better to get to the politics we want, and then we can adjust and fine-tune the rules so they work more to our liking. So I'm certainly not opposed to broadening the size of the House, but I think there's a whole bunch of work we need to do and can and should do in the meantime to set the stage for that. And if we don't do that work, expanding the House isn't going to really resolve things.
So can you talk about then what are these attributes of good leaders that you that need to be more manifest in all these domains?
Yeah, I think there's a few, and a couple of the projects we have launched at Lyceum Labs are really getting at these. I think one is an appreciation for the diversity and pluralism of the country and of the district and of the constituency. So And I think we've come to valorize and notice and cover what I would call the inveterate polarizers, the kind of the performative. We used to call them show horses. I realize that's not the right term, but the people who always are going for a mic and often speaking into that mic with unstinting ideological positions, right? The more our Congress fills up with people who that's their mode of operating, again, if we had a parliament, that would be great. That's totally fine to have that kind of politician in a parliament. And you see them on C-SPAN when we hear question time for the prime minister. But in a representative Congress where your opponent today might be the vote you need tomorrow to form a coalition to solve a problem that is relevant for both of your districts, that style of politics is not helpful. So I think there is a way of pragmatic pluralism that's necessary. And to be really clear, what I'm not talking about here is what's often caricatured as the hail fellow, well met, centrism, let's meet in the middle, bipartisan solutions. It's not. I still expect people who have this spirit are going to be fully across the ideological spectrum, but it's more the mode with which they're engaging both with their allies and their opponents in Congress. So that's, I think, one dimension of leadership that we need. I think another dimension of leadership we need is a creativity to connect with and to represent one's constituents. I think Congress continues to lag greatly in terms of members understanding and knowing the perspectives of their constituents, and not just the ones that are really vocal or are turning out at town halls, but across the close to 1 million people that a House member is representing. I think technology can solve a lot of that problem, both with inbound communication and outbound communication, but it requires, I think, frankly, a rising generation of digitally native millennial and Gen Xers to really lean into that opportunity and challenge. I think that's a second component. And then the third component is, and this is not an exhaustive list, but the third thing is a leadership dimension back to the constituency. So part of representation, as I just mentioned, is to be really attuned to the constituency that you represent and what problems people are trying to solve in that district, and to be helping them solve that problem in whatever ways that you can. But I think there's also a role of a political leader, which is to lead and to listen and to learn to one's constituents, certainly, but also to reason with and ultimately to lead them. And it's not either or, it's a two-way interplay. But the representatives and senators that I think we need at this juncture are people that are able to operate in both modes within that interplay. We need more people who are both, getting better at listening and learning, but also reasoning and leading.
Yes, you've sort of already started to answer my next question, which is about what congressional representation should mean. And so It sounds like from our discussion, you think representatives need to make their own judgments about what's in the interests of their constituents, and that the constituency itself is a very broad concept that covers everyone. Would that be accurate?
Yes, and I think it is also. I think what representation, worse forms of it have come to mean have been about, is my voice being heard in the national media? Do I have a platform to share my point of view, which may or may not reflect the viewpoints of the people that I have been elected to represent, but it's something that my party, or in some cases just even me as a person, feel obliged to put out there. And so I think I think we've got, you're always going to have some of that. I think right now we're quickly having too much of it. So the capacity to speak for, on behalf, and to solve problems for the people one has been elected to represent. I think the capacity to tend to the needs of the institution in which one is doing that representation is also really important. Going back to the select committee, let me describe a bit more what I saw them doing. In any institution, you need some people who are tending to the needs of the institution. And I think after a long period of neglect, the members of the select committee, were able to marshal a sufficient, kind of critical mass of concern for the institution that they were able to materially improve it. Generally, I think it's important that members of Congress find ways to, on balance, leave the institution stronger by dint of their having served in it than it was before they arrived, so that part of representation is also strengthening our representative institutions. I see that as another part. And I think that, one of the interesting things that I think there are, times where, sharply contested and entirely unconventional forms of representation are warranted and called for. And I'll just give you one example. It's not from Congress, but more recently from the Tennessee debate over guns. And this is something I've written about, where the two young representatives, Justin Jones and Justin Pearson, ended up speaking to protesters and kind of leading chants with protesters who came into the gallery of the Tennessee State House. And, it was an act of demagoguery. It broke all norms and decorum. It led to them being expelled. And so it was a fraud. I mean, I'm not saying that that was an unproblematic exercise of leadership, but I think if you step back and look at the fact that, Tennessee has an incredibly intense partisan gerrymander that dramatically overrepresents the white and rural and Republican areas at the expense of the communities of color that are typically younger, that are thinking about the issues of gun violence and responsible gun control in different ways in the larger cities. The exhausting of all legitimate means within the legislature to put the issue on the agenda. And so to me, that itself was I would say, in aggregate, recognizing all the trade-offs and downsides, a worthy act of representation on the part of the people that they were endeavoring to represent in the legislature. So I guess what I'm saying here is that it's not the kind of representation that I'm talking about doesn't always follow the norms or sit naturally within the institutions, but when it departs from them, there really needs to be a compelling reason for doing so. And anyway, I'll just leave it there. But that's something that's been intriguing me also.
Since you've thought so much about representation, maybe I'll ask you then a harder question, which is about the future generations, right? So, you can articulate the constituency as the people who are currently alive in the district, right? But then there's all these future generations of people. Who represents them, especially if you can borrow money or you can degrade the environment and impact their lives. You can stick them with a bill and you can stick them with a bad environment. Who represents them? Are they represented by the current member in Congress, or does that member just represent the people who are here today, and somehow through those people they're capturing that future generation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I don't have any kind of deep insights into solving it. I do think what's interesting is that different political entities are setting up offices to represent explicitly represent future generations, and I know there's been some climate fiction and science fiction that have been written that capture that. I think there's a couple of things. One is, I think part of the reason that our representative bodies, Congress certainly, but also in state houses, are struggling with their legitimacy in ways that in a system of representative government, I think is continues to be deeply problematic is the demographics of these bodies in aggregate are so out of whack with those of the society as a whole. And I think there will inherently be a problem when the elected officials depart so much from the demographic, profile of society. And this is not a new debate. If you go back and look at the founding, and there was a sense that this was in many ways the core of the anti-federalist critique of the Constitution, is that the Congress was not sufficiently a mirror. The legislative body wasn't a mirror of representation, mirror in terms of reflecting, but it was prone to elitism. And so there's a bit of that built into our system. But I think one answer to your question, again, working within our political institutions, is mobilizing, encouraging, recruiting, enabling, supporting rising generations of politicians, millennials and Gen Z, to really come into the fore. And I think right now, given the food fight that is our legislative politics, they are looking to make their mark in the world through nonprofits and through business rather than through politics. So one of the reasons we set up Lyceum Labs is to start to articulate the challenges and the rewards and the appeal of political leadership and life as a politician as a worthy outlet for talented people. Our system of government hinges on, better types of people raising their hand and running for office. And if all we have are people who are drawn by the ideological contest, that doesn't bode well for the republic. So part of what Lyceum Labs is a response to your question of how do we hasten and facilitate and inform this rising generation of leaders who are going to bring more of a future perspective, because it'll be their children and their children's children living in it. Related to that, overlapping but I think distinct, are the values and perspectives that lawmakers are bringing with them into the bodies in which they're serving as representatives. And again, this is not a new idea. The idea of posterity, of leading in ways that will resonate through not the current generation or the next one, but for several. That is an age-old conservative concern of the kind of seeing the governmental enterprise as not involving one generation, but prior generations and future generations. And there's now, I think, some interesting importation of this concept, largely from the progressive side, talking about there are different, indigenous peoples' perspectives on, thinking like an ancestor and thinking for 7 generations. 100% commendable. I think that is a worthy standard. I was on a call recently with a group of progressives who were describing this, and I was, endorsing it, but I also thought to myself, I didn't say it, but I thought it. This is conservatism. This is the idea that our institutions are a trust, our Congress is a trust, our state legislatures are a trust, and we need to lead these institutions in at least as good, if not better, shape than we found them. And we need to be making policy in them that speaks not only to the needs of our generation, but doesn't mortgage the future of our children and their children and their children's generation. So I think a little bit it's just different demographics, and I think it is a return to some of the values that I think at different junctures, we've had far-sighted legislators who have thought out across generations, and we need more of that.
Next question is about Congress's time. If you could dictate how they'd spend it, how would you allocate it in the home district versus, DC, legislative versus oversight, dialing for dollars? Where would you allocate the time?
Yeah, of course it's going to, vary based on the aspirations of the legislature, their role within the institution. Are they a caucus leader? They're a committee person? Are they a policy person? Are they, what's the role that they're playing? I don't have the strong view that the time in the district is somehow less worthy than the time in DC, just because I think that's part of the representational function. And I continue to think that the for some members, not all, but for some members, the solicitation of funding, and ironically, not so much for their own campaigns, but to establish their bona fides within their party is not time well spent. So I think less time devoted to that. One of a really interesting perspective we commissioned when I was at Hewlett by a wonderful scholar named Michael Melvin, who's emeritus now at SUNY Albany, but who's been very instrumental in supporting the campaign finance reform in the state of New York. And it draws on his ideas that there's matching supporting donations from within one's constituency. So when I think about reducing the time that people are spending dialing for dollars, it's if they are connecting with and reaching out to their constituents that they actually represent, I don't see that as much of a problem. It's when people who are representing the southern half of Ingham County, Michigan, feel obliged to come out to Silicon Valley, where I used to live, to raise money because they aren't in a position to get the resources they need, or aren't focusing on getting the resources they need where they are. So I think less time dialing for dollars outside of one's own constituency is a problem. And I think one area that I guess I want to draw a distinction between legislation and oversight, and maybe the goal here would be to get members and representatives and legislators thinking more of the cycle of that you're making law, you're overseeing the law, you're fine-tuning the law, that to see those as different sides of the coin or different parts of the cycle. But I think that presumes a elevation of committee and subcommittee work as the bodies that are doing the bulk of that cycle, and that's something that I think is really important. I recently had occasion to talk with a number of impressive state lawmakers, and I'm just struck by, especially in our citizen legislators, where there just isn't there's kind of a flurry of activity for 3 or 4 months every other year, how hard it is to be an informed lawmaker that is tracking policy over time and refining it and fine-tuning it. There's very few problems that Congress needs to solve that it can solve on the first go. So anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, but I think more time in that recurring cycle of learning, policy development, legislation, oversight, and refinement would be useful.
Great. Well, next question is, how should debate, deliberation, or dialogue occur or be structured in Congress? Do you see it happening in the committees, on the floor, back rooms? What's your perspective? How that should happen?
I think part of it would be, I would just build on the answer in my last response, which is I think more of that needs to be occurring within committees and subcommittees that have responsibility for making policy and overseeing policy. And I think, as we all know, committees have been subordinated to the majority work of the majority, which is often undertaken behind closed doors by the leadership of the majority in ways that I think almost guarantee that the best ideas and the initiative and aspirations of individual lawmakers to represent their particular constituent states and districts are not being realized. So I think that also speaks to the need to return more to a committee or something like that substructure. That's where more of it needs to occur. I also think there is and this is something that my friends James Wallner and Phil Wallach and a few others have mentioned. I think more, and James is really good on this point, that we often, is it the case that the leaders of both houses are doing too much behind closed doors? Yes. Is it the case that they are enabled in doing so by members that are not taking full advantage and pushing forward and bringing forward the different points of view about what should be happening in the legislative body, I would say yes to that too. So I think it would be good to have more individual legislators, expressing the changes that they want to make and bringing that out into the open in their respective bodies, so then we can then hash it out versus always deferring to the leaders, as we know parties in the conditional party government theory are inclined to do when the two parties are polarized and there's a lot of coherence within each party.
And given our discussion earlier about parties and the opaque nature of what's happening inside them, do you have a perspective on this committee system, whether how much should be private debate and deliberation versus transparent through C-SPAN or through minutes, et cetera?
That's a good question. As a rule, I think it is hard to hash out and negotiate contentious issues in public. I think that's true. I think it's also the case that in light of the debate going back to the 60s and 70s around transparency and the sunshine effects that were instituted in the Reform Act of 1970 and in the early 70s, I think it's hard once in a democratic system you have opened something up to close it back down. As someone once said when I was kind of raising this point, they made the point, well, there's always a room where people can go, and I think that generally that's true. I think in some ways the Select Committee was an exemplar here in terms of how they structured some of their debates and discussions that were not private, but structured in such a way that allowed for more conversation and deliberation versus kind of a performative setting where people have 5 minutes and rather using that to explore issues with a witness to just deliver the talking points or to berate the witness while delivering the talking points. So I think there's more that could be done by creative committee and subcommittee leaders and ranking members to allow for deliberation in those settings than currently is the case.
Great. Well, next question is, what fundamental institutional improvement should Congress make within 50 years?
Yes, this is a mind bender. I think the breakthrough that needs to occur is adopting, using, implementing technological solutions that in constructive ways will reduce the representational difference while paradoxically enabling better deliberation. What do I mean by that? I mean, if members of Congress on the issues being debated had a clear view of the range of opinions within their, in the case of a member of the House, 800,000 constituents on that issue, that wouldn't necessarily change their view or their vote, but it would, I think, inform their deliberations. It would also inform their constituents and the broader public about their deliberations. And I think that could be salutary. Now, I'm not suggesting is that let's just let the people vote. And there are some theorists of democracy who are saying, well, why do we need representatives if we can use sortition or some technical means to resolve these problems? I think we need representatives to work through issues that can't be resolved in that way. But I think those that working through can be much more informed than it is today by the points of view and perspectives of the people in districts and states. And this is, again, going back to my theme about working with the grain of the institution. We have and will continue to have geographically grounded representation. And I think one of the pathologies we have now is the actual preferences being represented by individual members are too often removed from the local circumstances and differences and diversity that lie within their constituencies. And if we could find a way of making that what people actually think and the range of views and the intensity of views within their district, I think that is going to actually lead to better deliberation, better forms of accountability, Because if members are not once or twice, but consistently cutting against strongly held views in their district, those members should have a real electoral contest the next time they come before the people. And I think if we can marshal the information that would help people see where are people really defecting when they shouldn't be, that will lead to those opportunities being surfaced in a way that they aren't now. So anyway, the 50-year breakthrough, I think, is this paradoxical innovation of having a much clearer view of the range and intensity and diversity of viewpoints in the constituency, and to have that be made available to the member and to the public in ways that could support versus undermine deliberation. So that's the mission of the next generation of reformers, should they choose to accept it.
Excellent. So next question is, what book or article most shaped your thinking with regard to congressional reform? Maybe you mentioned it earlier. Was it that early report from 1946 or something else?
No, I would, if I can pick two or three here, certainly that report and the legislative action, the subsequent report of the Select Committee and the Legislative Reorganization Act as a bundle, that I think was quite salutary for me, just because it highlighted how ideas go from civil society to procedural entrepreneurs, institutional entrepreneurs in Congress into law. A couple of other kind of landmark studies. A seminal one for me, going back in grad school, which informed my dissertation, and I often find myself dipping back into, is the kind of magisterial Decline and Resurgence of Congress that Jim Sundquist, who was a wonderful scholar at the Brookings Institution for many years, wrote in the early 1980s, really looking at the congressional attempt to, kind of regain relevance and claw back authority it had ceded to Congress in the 1970s, and the fact that it did so in ways that weren't always unproblematic. So that was another masterful account. But I would say the most influential one is just a tremendous book by Julian Zelizer called On Capitol Hill, which is in the subtitle. I actually have it right here. On Capitol Hill, The Struggle to Reform Congress and Its Consequences, 1948 to 2000. And it just is to me, a incredibly holistic assessment of how, over 2 or 3 generations, a group of reformers sought to reorient Congress in ways that impacted the institution in salutary ways. I think by moving away from the chokehold that these conservative Southern segregationists had on too much of what Congress had done through their seniority system and the malapportionment, and Congress was too stable. I think you could argue, and I think he took it through 2000 to show that you could also, the pendulum could swing in the other direction. You could move completely away from a committee system to one that, certainly in the case of Jim Wright and then Newt Gingrich, became too leader dominated. But to me, that is just a masterful tracing of how reformers in Congress, how civil society groups, how social pressures, new policy demands lead Congress to evolve. So that would be the one I would point to.
Great. Well, last question is really about, what you have coming up on the horizon with Lyceum and any other efforts you have, regarding congressional reform and your leadership initiatives.
Yeah, a couple of things. The project at Lyceum Labs, and everything I do is a project with one or other, more blue chip partners. There's a project I'm working on with Emily Cherniak, who's the founding director of New Politics, called Leading to Govern. And there, what we're trying to do is to highlight how highly capable leaders, once they've managed to get elected, which is hard, can then tackle the even harder problem of how do I represent a diverse constituency? How do I govern? How do I get things done on behalf of the people I'm working on behalf of, in ways that enable them to flourish, the country to flourish, the institution I'm serving in to flourish, and me to flourish, because that's another dimension, is how hard this work is to serve as a representative And we've finished up an exploratory set of interviews that have underscored for us the importance of sharing more about this, and we're kind of regrouping now. And my hope would be, by the end of this year, we would start to share in much more detail what we're learning from that, with the idea, again, to start interesting, informing, equipping a rising generation of leaders to raise their hand and say, I'll run for office. So that's, I think, a really big and important part of the project. And then I'm also working on going back to the need to denationalize our politics. I've been working on an assessment that revisits some great political science on that topic, written by a number of conservative political scientists, again in the mid-20th century, and thinking about how we can't apply their exact solutions today, and in all cases wouldn't necessarily want to, but how could we get back to a more decentralized party system that was more attentive to the issues facing different parts of the country? I think that would lead to more pluralism in our politics. I think that would be better for the polity, certainly would be better for Congress. So those are the two pending projects.
Excellent, Daniel. Thank you so much for the work that you've done to support Congress and try to make it a better place. And good luck with the upcoming projects. I look forward to seeing the results.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to. I've appreciated the nascent partnership we have with Sunwater here, and I look forward to continuing to work with you and explore ways to reinforce each other's efforts.
Thanks.